Everyone. In the fortnight since I've done an Inside the Lords, the world has changed beyond recognition almost. And I think what's happened with the events in relation to America, particularly in response to it throwing Ukraine under the bus, making its decisions about how to deal with Ukraine, that infamous fight with Zelensky and JD Vance and Trump, and everything that's followed, has had a profound impact on UK politics and therefore on Parliament. So that's why I'm raising it. Now, there's a lot to be said about a new world order that's both becoming apparent now, but which has actually been a long time coming. And I tried to say some of those things on Politics Live, so I'll put a link to that discussion rather than reiterate it here. I wanted to reflect on the impact it's had on parliamentarians, particularly in the House of Lords. And there's a couple of observations I'd like to make. On the one hand, it's turned politics into a serious game. You feel as though the world is changing. What we say maybe matters. But there's a little bit of me that is very anxious about the fact that some people are really kind of puffed up by this new role. Everybody who's ever been involved in international politics or geopolitics historically, in the Lords, anyone who's had anything to do with the Foreign Office, are kind of walking round as though they are running the world. And let's be honest, whilst it's impressive to have seen Keir Starmer, who I'm not a great fan of, rising to the challenge, there's also a sense in which I feel as though they're more comfortable at the level of a kind of globalist agenda and solving the problems of the world and meeting over in Brussels or having meetings in London, but with international leaders, than they are in dealing with some of the rather more difficult issues at home. And there's always been a historic tradition of British politicians in particular using events far away, being international statesmen, kind of strolling around the world as a way of distracting, not in a conspiratorial way, but distracting nonetheless from their inadequacies in terms of sorting out UK politics. And I was really struck by the fact that that's a tension that I don't really know the answer to. I want them to behave like grown-ups in the room and take on some statesman-like qualities. But at the same time as there was various international conversations being had out, there was a farmers' protest outside the door, which nobody will address the fact that UK farming is being also thrown under the bus by our own government, that this has got serious repercussions. And I talked to some of the farmers and they just felt, whilst everyone wants to solve, a European war, why have they launched a war against agricultural workers and people who run the means through which we make food in this country? And I think there's just something in that. So I want to mull over and watch. But I was really struck by the difference between what's happening in the outside world and what happens in Parliament. When we finished off this week the discussions on the Terrorism Protection of Buildings Bill, which has to be one of the most ridiculous responses to terrorism that there has ever been, which is as a consequence of the Manchester Arena tragedy and bombing and murder and slaughter of young people who went out for a concert one night. One of the big initiatives that's emerged has been to introduce a national regulator that will force all sorts of venues and places where people meet, from community centres through to people going out for a concert, live music venues and so on, are now going to have to jump through the enormous amount of regulatory hoops, are going to have to fulfill wide range of bureaucratic governance criteria and targets and so on. And so we finish it off with a couple of speeches below, but honestly, it just feels so far removed, and I actually said that, from the real problems that we face. Actually, in relation to terrorism, it doesn't tackle any of the issues that are really creating an atmosphere of insecurity. It certainly doesn't tackle the problem that you can't talk about having secure borders when we actually have a situation where having domestic security, or even secure borders when we're talking about Ukraine, when we're in a situation where we haven't got secure borders, where actually we don't know how to deal with the fact that so many people who are now living in this country are undocumented. We don't have a government plan for dealing with the rise of either radical Islamism, which they obviously go out of their way to avoid, or even these one-off individual, more incel, confusing type individuals who are creating mayhem. And it just feels like an invasion yet once more. Another thing that happened this week was it was International Women's Day. And therefore there is always a debate. International Women's Day at the House of Lords is one to avoid. I actually spoke at the debate 3 years ago, and I actually, would you believe, and it was about silencing women and how women could be given a vote. And my speech was actually about the grooming gangs before, as they say, it was fashionable. And it was, I talked about those young women whose cries had been ignored and not taken any notice of. And of course, I realised that I'd broken the golden rule of House of Lords International Women's Day debates, which was to not repeat a load of cliches and, literally cut and paste briefings that they'd received from a wide range of NGOs, where everybody said the most important thing is that we tackle the problem of violence against women and girls. And then when I actually raised a concrete example of horrific violence against young women and girls, everybody was tutting and disapproving, because it was the wrong kind of girls, the wrong kind of violence, the wrong kind of politics. Anyway, I sat in on the International Women's Day debate for some of it yesterday, and it was dispiriting. That's the only term that I could say. But the great thing about being in Parliament was that I had the opportunity to go to a very lively, heartfelt, genuine gathering of women called by Rosie Duffield and somebody who works with her, Emma even, who put an event on about the women of Afghanistan, women in Afghanistan. And, you could say, oh, well, that's all very well, but it was actually brilliant, young UK pupils and students reading out letters from young women in Afghanistan. It was very moving, fantastic food, would you believe, in the middle of it all. Afghani food. It was just a fantastic, genuine effort at saying, all right, we're going to have this International Women's Day, which can so often just be box ticking. Let's at least do something meaningful. And it had a real nice sense of solidarity. The other thing that I've done this week is there's been a review of the Code of Conduct as applied to members of the House of Lords. The Code of Conduct used to not be written. It was basically a code of honour, and the House of Lords is a self-regulating house, which meant that you were meant to keep each other in check. Over the years, it's grown into one of those kind of monstrous HR style, if you break this rule, if you break that rule. Now, there's lots of rules, by the way, that seem eminently sensible. People in the House of Lords often have serious and far-reaching financial interests that might clash with their parliamentary work. There are good reasons to not necessarily just say, I trust you. I understand that. And there are rules that are helpful, but it's become, like all codes of conduct, one of those ways of policing behaviour and often speech. There's been a review. I have spoken about what needed to be changed in the past. And actually, to her credit, the chair of the Code of Conduct Committee, Baroness Manningham Buller, who used to be the head of MI5, and is always one of those women that I'm both absolutely in awe of and scared of at the same time, has done a really good job of cutting back, which is rare, cutting back on the words in the code, the numbers of rules there are, simplifying it. It's actually not a bad job, but there remains some really dangerous and egregious parts to it in terms of bullying and harassment and those definitions and how they can be used to and weaponized in ways that treat us as children on the one hand, who need to have external forces keeping their eye on us, and also, I think, poisoning the well when it comes to interpersonal relations on the parliamentary estate. Anyway, my speech is below. We only got 4 minutes. But one thing I wanted to share with you was I've often said, and I said in the speech, that the process is the punishment. And to tell you what it's like, I received an email from the Code of Conduct Committee recently And as soon as you get an email like that, I was frightened to open it. I genuinely thought, oh no, oh my God, no, what is this? Anyway, eventually I opened it to be told that actually the complaint against me had been investigated and had not didn't amount to anything. But the terror of I don't even know why they feel the need to send me the complaint, if you see what I mean, because I thought, as nothing's happened, why did you tell? But it's an intimidation that's inevitably chilling. And if you want to know what it was about a speech I gave in discussing the mental health bill about ADHD. And there'd been a formal complaint put in by somebody who said that my speech amounted to harassment and bullying of people with ADHD and was based on misinformation and so on. And obviously it was a speech I gave in good faith. It was an opinion. It was perfectly pertinent to the debate and the bill that we were discussing. But I think that there will be lots of people who've had those kind of emails. And so even those people who are not, where the complaint is not pursued and there isn't an investigation. And by the way, when there's an investigation, they publish this big paper about you with every single email. It's really horrible. It's really, it's career destroying, reputation destroying, horrible situation. And you don't have any, it's very difficult to see that you have any fairness in terms of redress. Anyway, there was no complaint to answer. And yet it still had that impact of making me think, you have to be careful what you say because you just do not want to get done under that code. I mentioned there in passing the mental health bill, and actually the week before last was the final committee stage of the mental health bill, and I had an amendment on mental health and how it applies to prisons and how the law is supposed to be changing. And so because it was my amendment, I got quite a long time to speak. It is quite interesting because it was quite late at night and there was only me in the front bench. So I didn't have an audience or a crowd. But I wanted to just say to you that although the mental health bill has been led by one minister, a health minister, Lord Timpson led on the prison part of it. And his response to me was a gratifying and positive way that ministerial responses can be, which is, first of all, I felt like he'd listened to what I'd said. And secondly, he answered intelligently with nuance and really made me think that what my worries were in relation to how prison is being used as a dumping ground for people who've got mental illness, and some of the problems that I raised also about how you deal with somebody like that recent case of Callacane, who the families felt was using mental illness as an excuse for the murders of their family members. Those kind of issues I really felt as though he took seriously. And subsequently, I've had need to contact Lord Timpson over a particular IPP prison, one of my big issues, and he got back to me straight away. So sometimes I come on here and I slag off ministers and I slag off the government and I say, they won't listen and so on and so forth. So I think it's always worth noting that a Labour minister, the prisons minister, Lord Timpson, did not do that, and I wanted to give him some credit. And sometimes you feel you might make a tiny, weeny little bit of difference, as I spend so many hours of my life over there. Just to finish off, we're going to be discussing the football governance bill next week, and I'd like to urge you to take a look at this bill. It's actually a bill that started in the House of Lords, but which will be going over to the House of Commons. We did a recent Substack in which I wrote up, as it were, a kind of beginner's guide to what this bill is all about, because I think that you have to always know that there are pieces of legislation that are passed in your name, and in this instance, it's supposedly to help fans, but which actually create regulatory monsters and have huge dangers of unintended consequences. And I really believe that the football governance bill will damage football. And for those of you who don't care about football, there are millions who do. There are many more millions who don't. The problem is that football is often a way that local communities pull together. It's part of the fabric of British society. It's actually part of social cohesion, funnily enough. And it's certainly a part of our lives for those who do care, or if they've got families who are football fans and so on. There's something that brings great joy, great irritation when your team isn't doing well, but great joy. It's really, really crucial that we don't allow an overly bureaucratic government to mess this up. So I'll be speaking next week on that. Take a look at the Substack link below and to our podcast, which is actually a really good podcast to listen to. And also, I think I'm going to be able to get a link of when I was on Martin Daubney's show on GB News about why it's important. To finish off, we've heard as I'm filming this about the two-tier sentencing regime, and I think it's a shock, but maybe not that surprising, to discover that the Independent Sentencing Review Board has made it clear that certain categories of people should be exempt from being sent to prison even when found guilty. That these characteristics should be looked at, and we discovered that they are people from ethnic minorities, from different cultural backgrounds, and also transgender perpetrators. And obviously this is a very dangerous trend, that people are not being treated equally under the rule of law. So there is rightly outrage. But maybe what's more important for a version for this week's Inside the Lords is to discover that Shamama Mahmood, who is the minister in charge of justice, who I happen to reckon is really good, just want to say, I think she's done quite a good job on lots of things. She is not able to overcome what the sentencing board says. In other words, the elected politicians of the day say that they are going to write to and object to what the sentencing review board is saying, but she can't undermine it. They have got the power. And too many decisions in this country are actually handed by elected politicians to unelected quangos and regulators, like Football Governance Bill will have an independent regulator, and they're handed these powers, and then the government say, what can we do? The regulators told us we've got to do this. It's happening all the time with Ofcom on the online safety bill. Or there's nothing we can do. This sentencing board has the power to make these decisions. We'll have to bring in another piece of legislation to overturn it. And I hope they do that on sentencing. But it means that although we can kid ourselves that we are over in Parliament, House of Commons, House of Lords, making laws accountable to you, the public and the electorate, in truth, the real power and the real decision making is happening behind the public's back. And that's something that I hope that we in Parliament can now tackle, because the quangocracy is a real anti-democratic threat to our freedoms and our capacity to change society in ways that we think important.